Experts try to catch Morgan Freeman. Lying, what he did instead left them speechless. Morgan Freeman leaned back in his chair, his hands folded, a calm expression on his face. Across from him sat a panel of experts, body language analysts, psychologists, and professional interrogators who had spent years mastering the art of detecting deception. "No one can fool us," one of them smirked. Morgan simply smiled. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Is acting about talent or deception? Comment 1 for talent, 0 for deception. The tension in the room was thick. A long table separated Morgan Freeman from the panel of experts, each of them armed with years of experience in spotting lies, hesitation, and micro-expressions. They weren't here to be entertained. They were here to prove that no one, no matter how skilled, could outplay their methods. "Mr. Freeman," Jonathan Hale, the lead analyst, said with a knowing smirk, "you may be a brilliant actor, but deception is a science. We can tell truth from lies with precision." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Lisa Carter, a seasoned psychologist, leaned forward. "That's right. Every person, no matter how skilled, has subconscious tells. A flicker in their eye, a shift in their breathing, a pause before answering." Morgan tilted his head as if considering their words. Then he leaned forward, his gaze steady, unreadable. "All right, let's play." Jonathan smiled, relishing the challenge. "We'll ask you a series of questions. Some will require truth, some will require lies, and we'll know exactly when you're not being honest." The other analysts nodded, confident in their expertise. Morgan simply adjusted his jacket. "I'll make it interesting for you," he said smoothly. "Let's see if you can tell the difference between truth and performance." They thought they could read him like an open book, but by the time he was done, they wouldn't know what to believe. The air inside the room was charged with tension, yet Morgan Freeman remained completely composed. Across from him, 3 of the world's top deception experts sat poised, confident in their ability to unravel any lie, any deception, no matter how skilled the person was. But what they didn't realize, they were sitting across from a master of truth and illusion. Jonathan Hale, the lead analyst, tapped a pen against the table, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Let's begin," he said, his voice steady. "The rules are simple. We'll ask you a series of questions. Some you'll answer truthfully, some you'll lie about. Our job is to tell the difference." Lisa Carter, the psychologist, smiled as she folded her hands neatly in front of her. "You see, Mr. Freeman, deception isn't just about words. It's about body language, micro-expressions, breathing patterns." She gestured toward a small monitor displaying his vitals. "Even the best actors have unconscious tells." Morgan tilted his head slightly, a knowing smirk creeping onto his face. "I suppose we'll see." The final panelist, Dr. Raymond Clark, an ex-FBI interrogator, leaned forward. "We will," he said, his tone confident. "And by the time we're done, we'll know exactly when you're lying." Morgan let out a soft chuckle. "Gentlemen, I do hope you're ready." Jonathan glanced at his notes, then looked up. "Let's start with something simple," he said. "What's your full name?" "Morgan Freeman." Lisa nodded slightly, glancing at the monitor. "That's true," she confirmed. "Good," Jonathan said, moving on. "Were you born in Tennessee?" "Yes." Again a glance at the monitor. "Truth." The panelists exchanged glances, pleased with their accuracy. This was easy. Morgan was an open book, but then... "All right," Jonathan said, his voice shifting. "Now let's make things interesting." Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Have you ever stolen something?" Morgan didn't hesitate. "Yes." The panelists stiffened. Lisa's eyes flickered to the monitor, then back to Morgan. She frowned. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "That's surprising," he said. "Care to elaborate?" Morgan sighed, as if recalling an old memory. "When I was 8, I took a small toy car from a store. It wasn't intentional. I had been holding it while browsing, and I walked out without realizing. When I got home, I was so scared I ran back and put it on the shelf." Lisa narrowed her eyes, tapping a few keys on her laptop. "That's interesting." Jonathan's lips curled into a smile. "What's wrong, Lisa?" She shook her head. "The machine says he's telling the truth." Dr. Clark chuckled. "Looks like we caught our first lie," he said, "because we know Morgan Freeman doesn't steal." Lisa, however, wasn't so sure. "Or maybe," she said slowly, "he's telling the truth, but not the whole truth." Morgan leaned back, his face unreadable. "Perhaps," he mused. The panelists exchanged glances. For the first time, they weren't entirely sure. Was he lying, or had he just played them? Dr. Clark cleared his throat. "All right, let's step it up a bit." He glanced at his notes, then locked eyes with Morgan. "Have you ever faked an emotion in real life?" Morgan's face didn't change. Not a twitch, not a flicker of hesitation. "No." The room went still. Lisa's fingers hovered over the monitor. She stared at the results, then back at Morgan. "That's a lie." Jonathan smirked, looking triumphant. "There it is, we caught him. But then," Morgan smiled, "did you?" Jonathan's smirk faltered. Lisa's brows furrowed. Dr. Clark leaned forward, intrigued. "Explain," he demanded. Morgan chuckled softly. "If I was lying, wouldn't I have shown hesitation? Wouldn't I have given you something to doubt?" Lisa opened her mouth, then shut it. Because he was right. There had been nothing. No shift, no pause, no break in his tone, nothing that would indicate deception. And yet, their system said he was lying. Lisa bit her lip. "Wait a second." Jonathan glanced at her. "What?" She typed furiously, scanning the data. Then her hand stopped. Her breath caught. "It's not that he lied," she murmured. "It's that he believed it." Jonathan's eyes widened. "You're telling me he's so good at controlling his emotions that even the machine can't tell?" Lisa looked at Morgan, her expression one of pure awe. "No," she whispered. "I'm telling you, he's so good he doesn't even have to fake it." The room fell into stunned silence. The panelists exchanged glances, realizing the impossible. They hadn't caught Morgan Freeman lying. They had just witnessed the truest form of acting ever displayed. The room was dead silent. Lisa Carter's voice still hung in the air, her revelation sinking into the minds of the panelists. "I'm telling you, he's so good he doesn't even have to fake it." Jonathan Hale shifted in his seat, his confidence now cracking at the edges. Dr. Clark's usual smirk had disappeared. And Morgan Freeman? He sat there, calm, composed, like he had been in control all along. Jonathan let out a breath, rubbing his temples. "All right, let's reset." He glanced at Lisa, then at Clark. "Maybe we got ahead of ourselves. Maybe he's just really good at emotional suppression." Morgan chuckled softly. "Oh, Jonathan," he mused, shaking his head, "if it helps you sleep at night, go ahead and believe that." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We're not done yet." He sat up straighter, gripping his pen like a weapon. "Let's raise the stakes." Lisa frowned. "Jonathan, if he's this good, maybe we should—" "No," Jonathan interrupted. "We can break him. Everyone has to tell. Everyone." Morgan simply smiled. "Go ahead then. Try." Jonathan folded his hands, his eyes narrowing. "Tell us, Mr. Freeman," he said, his voice dropping. "Have you ever truly loved someone?" The room froze. Lisa sucked in a breath. Clark's eyebrows lifted. Even the camera operators behind the glass glanced at each other. It was a question designed to break a person down, because love was something even the greatest actors couldn't fully control. A heartbeat too fast, a tremble in the fingers, a moment of hesitation. But Morgan, he leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and then, in a voice so low, so intimate, he spoke. "Once." The panelists stilled. Lisa swallowed hard. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morgan's gaze drifted ever so slightly. "A woman who taught me how to see the world differently," he murmured. Jonathan leaned in closer. "What happened to her?" Morgan sighed, rubbing his fingers together, his expression distant. "She passed away before I could tell her what she meant to me." Lisa's eyes glossed over. Jonathan exhaled softly. Even Clark seemed moved. Then, Lisa glanced at the monitor and her breath hitched, because despite the emotion in his words, despite the pain he had just described, the machine still said he was lying. Lisa looked up, shaken. That was a lie. Jonathan's head snapped up. What? The monitor says he was lying, Lisa repeated, her voice trembling. Jonathan stared at Morgan, stunned. So none of that was real? Morgan tilted his head, his expression betraying nothing. Wasn't it? He asked, his voice smooth. Lisa's fingers curled into fists. That's not possible. I felt that. We all did. Clark let out a slow breath. Oh my God, he muttered, shaking his head. We weren't watching him lie. He turned to Lisa and Jonathan, his voice hushed with awe. We were watching him create reality. Jonathan looked genuinely unnerved. How? How do you do that? Morgan leaned back, a small smile playing at his lips. Because you're not just listening to my words, he said softly. You're believing the story I want you to believe. The silence that followed was thick with realization. Lisa shook her head in shock. So you can make anyone believe anything? Morgan chuckled. Only if I want to. Jonathan swallowed hard. Then, how do we know anything you've said today was true? Morgan's smile widened. You don't. They had walked into this thinking they could expose him, but now they weren't even sure what was real anymore. Jonathan Hale had always prided himself on being the smartest person in the room. He had spent years dissecting human behavior, analyzing patterns, uncovering deception where others saw only truth. But right now, he felt like he was drowning. Lisa Carter sat beside him, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dr. Clark, usually so composed, stared at Morgan Freeman with an expression that bordered on disbelief. They weren't leading this game anymore. Morgan was, and they had just realized they were completely outmatched. Jonathan exhaled, forcing himself to regain control. All right, Mr. Freeman, he said, his voice firmer now. Let's cut through the theatrics. We need to know, who is the real Morgan Freeman? Morgan chuckled softly, shaking his head. That's the wrong question. Jonathan frowned. Excuse me. Morgan leaned forward, his gaze steady, unwavering. The question isn't who I am, Jonathan. He let the moment stretch, watching as they hung on to his every word. The question is, who do you believe I am? The air shifted. A tension, thick and unrelenting, coiled around the table. Lisa's throat felt dry, because suddenly she understood. Morgan hadn't been answering their questions. He had been shaping their reality. With every carefully chosen word, with every shift in tone, with every moment of hesitation, or lack thereof. He's not lying, she whispered. Jonathan turned to her, irritated. What are you talking about? Lisa licked her lips, choosing her words carefully. He's telling the truth. But the monitor said, exactly. Jonathan blinked. What? Lisa turned back to Morgan, eyes wide with realization. You're so good at embodying emotion that even your body believes it. Morgan smiled. And what does that mean? Lisa exhaled. It means... She trailed off, shaking her head. It means we've been looking at this all wrong. Jonathan's jaw tightened. No, he snapped, his frustration spilling out. That's not possible. Everyone has a tell. Everyone has a moment of hesitation, a crack in the performance. Morgan's smile never wavered. Are you sure? Jonathan slammed his hands onto the table. You're a man, not a machine. There's no way you can fabricate an entire reality without slipping. It's impossible. Morgan let the silence stretch. Then softly, maybe for you. Jonathan's breath caught. Morgan's voice had shifted, just slightly, deeper, smoother. He wasn't just answering a question anymore, he was performing. And Jonathan suddenly felt like the subject of his own experiment. Lisa ran a shaky hand through her hair. So that story you told us about the woman you loved? Morgan met her gaze. What about it? Lisa hesitated. Was it true? Morgan tilted his head. Does it matter? Lisa sucked in a breath. It matters to us. Morgan leaned back, studying her. Why? Lisa's mouth opened, then closed. Because... She didn't have an answer. Dr. Clark, who had been silent for far too long, finally spoke. This was never about catching you lying, was it? Morgan turned to him, his expression unreadable. What do you think? Clark exhaled, shaking his head. I think you just proved that the line between truth and performance doesn't exist for you. Morgan smiled. Now you're getting it. Jonathan clenched his fists. So what are you saying? That we can never tell when you're lying? Morgan's eyes gleamed. I'm saying you'll never even know if I started lying in the first place. The air inside the observation room felt thick, suffocating, as if the weight of realization had drained the oxygen from the space. Morgan Freeman sat with his hands folded, his face calm, unreadable. Across from him, Jonathan Hale, Lisa Carter, and Dr. Clark were beginning to understand a terrifying truth. They hadn't just lost control of the game, they had never had control to begin with. Jonathan's fingers drummed against the table, his frustration now boiling over. All right, fine. You're good, really good. His voice was tight, forced, but let's not pretend you're untouchable. Morgan gave him a slow, measured look. Oh. Jonathan leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You're still human, Freeman, which means you still have emotions. And emotions betray us all eventually. Lisa glanced at Jonathan, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jonathan, maybe we should... No! Jonathan snapped, his gaze locked on Morgan. We're not done yet. The tension crackled between them. Jonathan's frustration was turning into something dangerous, something personal. And Morgan? Morgan simply waited, because he knew what was coming, and he was ready. Jonathan exhaled sharply, flipping through his notes. All right, since deception is your greatest strength, let's strip it away. He tapped his pen against the table. One last question, Mr. Freeman. Morgan gave him the smallest hint of a smile. Go on. Jonathan's gaze darkened. What is the biggest regret of your life? The room went silent. Lisa's breath caught. Clark's jaw tensed. Because this was not just a question, this was an attack. A calculated strike designed to rattle even the strongest mind. A tactic Jonathan had used before, one that always worked. Because no matter how composed a person was, no matter how well they could craft a lie, regret was real. Regret was raw. Regret was impossible to fake. And Jonathan was willing to bet that even Morgan Freeman couldn't hide from it. For the first time that day, Morgan didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch. Lisa studied him closely, looking for a tell, a crack in the armor. Jonathan's smirk returned. What's wrong, Freeman? No clever answer for this one. Morgan finally exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. Then he leaned forward, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The biggest regret of my life. He paused. The room hung onto his every breath. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he said, believing that people like you could ever truly understand people like me. Jonathan's smirk vanished. Lisa's fingers twitched. Clark exhaled slowly, as if finally understanding something too big to put into words. Morgan's gaze was unrelenting. You wanted to break me, he continued, but you never realized you were never in control. Jonathan swallowed hard, because suddenly he felt small. Not because of Morgan's words, but because of what they revealed. He had spent his career believing that power belonged to those who could expose weakness. But Morgan Freeman had just taught him something far more dangerous. True power belonged to the person who controlled the story. And today? Today, Jonathan wasn't the one telling it. He thought he had cracked Morgan Freeman. Morgan had been watching him unravel all along. The room was still, the weight of Morgan Freeman's words settling into the bones of everyone present. Jonathan Hale, who had spent his entire career exposing deception, suddenly felt exposed himself. He had entered this challenge believing he was in control. But the truth was that Morgan had never needed to lie, because real power didn't come from deception, it came from knowing who you are and making others believe it too. Jonathan let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. For the first time in years, he had no rebuttal, no counter-argument, no carefully crafted response to salvage his pride. He had spent his life believing that reading people made him superior. But today he had learned that understanding people was far more important than exposing them. Lisa Carter, still shaken, finally spoke. "Mr. Freeman, I have to ask." Morgan looked at her, waiting. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the beginning. "Did you ever actually lie to us?" Morgan smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "I told you exactly what you needed to hear," he said simply. Jonathan let out a soft laugh, one laced with defeat and admiration. "Damn," he muttered. Morgan stood up, adjusting his coat. "Next time," he said, his deep voice carrying through the room, "remember this. Truth and performance aren't opposites. The best actors don't lie. They make you believe." And with that, he walked out, leaving them with the one thing they had never expected: doubt in their own certainty. They had spent years uncovering lies. But today, Morgan Freeman had taught them that the most powerful truths are the ones you never see coming. Through this story, we realize that real power isn't about manipulation, it's about influence. Morgan Freeman never needed to lie. Because true mastery isn't in deception, it's in belief. Jonathan Hale thought he understood human nature, but he learned that the greatest actors don't fake emotions, they become them. And in the end, it's not about how well you can detect lies, it's about how well you understand why people believe in the first place. Because the most dangerous truth of all is the one that feels real.